This is the United States History 201 presentation 19, Southern Economy and Society. So in the last presentation we talked about the Deep North. Now we're going to shift our focus to the South. So oftentimes the South is considered to be like a specimen. It's an insect or something you examine, or a dead cat that you're going to dissect, because it seemed to be an anomaly. It's something odd. It's something that has a bacteria to look at. But the Southern economy and the South in general is much like the rest of the world in the 19th century. It was agriculture and it did have slavery, but so did much of the rest of the world in the 19th century. Really, it was the industrializing North that was different. And the South really was indicative of the entire United States for much of its history. Southern heroes were American heroes. The South was quintessentially American. The image of the United States was Daniel Boone, who was a Southerner, or Davy Crockett, who was a Southerner. And if you look at the presidents, if you just take a look at, say, for example, of the first 7 presidents, 5 are from the South. And even if you move beyond that, then you get just a little bit beyond that. In the first group, most of the presidents in the first 16 were from the South. So the South dominated the government, and the North knew it, which is why they were so antagonistic with the South at times. But anyways, this dependence on agriculture would ultimately lead to problems, and particularly during the war, the Civil War, because the South couldn't keep up. They couldn't produce the industrial items necessary to win the war. And so this agricultural society would eventually fall apart. Now, their primary exports were cash crops, things like tobacco, indigo, rice. You actually had 2 different types of cotton. You had long staple and short staple cotton. Long staple cotton is grown in the, again, very long growing seasons of the coastal areas of the Carolinas and Georgia. Short staple cotton can be grown just about anywhere, but it has a lot more seeds. And so it's harder to get the seeds out of the cotton plant. And with the cotton gin, with Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793, that's going to change cotton production, because now you can get the seeds out, and so now cotton can be grown anywhere, and that's going to lead to the cotton revolution. So this is a nice map of all the different kinds of agricultural products that were produced in the South, everything from cotton to corn to rice, rye, sugarcane, tobacco, and hemp. So the South was a major agricultural section in so many ways. This area, so many ways, the dominant economic section of the United States. And if you look at the expansion of slavery, it follows right in line with the expansion of cotton. So here you have areas of large slave concentrations, generally tobacco-producing areas, the Tidewater area of Virginia, and then also here the rice and cotton-producing areas of the Carolinas and Georgia, South Carolina and Georgia. But then you did start seeing cotton production here in the upcountry, and ultimately cotton would expand, as you see, in 1860. So wherever cotton was produced, you had large concentrations of slaves. Now, this dependence on agriculture led to a lack of industry. You did have industrial centers, places like Columbus, Georgia, and Richmond, Virginia, and Augusta, Georgia. But the South had excellent rivers, making internal improvements unimportant. Now, there were Southerners who thought that the South should keep up with the Northern economy, James DeBow, for example. But the question is why? Because Southerners looked at this and said, well, we have industrial centers, okay, great, but we can make money on cotton. So why should we put our money into a factory that may fail when there's a sure thing to get a plantation and grow cotton or tobacco or anything like that? So, in fact, Natchez, Mississippi was the wealthiest district in the United States before the war. A lot of money here in the South built on cotton production. Southem Society was generally rich and poor, black and white. There was some middle class. You had merchants, yeoman farmers, and middling landowners. But it was a very homogeneous society. Very few immigrants. Those that they did have were Scots-Irish and French Huguenots. So the South, unlike the North, where we talked about immigration, was not being affected by immigration and the large influx of new peoples as the North was. The planter class had the large plantations modeled after the finest homes or estates in Europe. Their children attended the best schools. These men had prominent positions in society. Think back to the Cavalier culture. These were the planters. Some of these people were northern transplants, particularly after the war. But the individuals who dominated Southern life, and by default for a long time American life, came from this planter class, this very conservative planter class. And the planter class helped foster that because they were well educated. They had a tremendous amount of independence because they did live on plantations. They weren't dependent on the government for their economic well-being. So these people, again, were the most important group in early American history. Now, when you look at their homes, this home, Nottoway Plantation, is in Louisiana. It was actually built right before the war between the states began. It is the largest plantation home in the country, in the South. It has 365 doors and windows. It's an enormous home, but it wasn't the largest home in the South itself. The largest home in the South was called Belle Grove Plantation. And just to give you the dimensions, it was 62 feet high, 122 feet wide, and 119 feet deep. It had over 70 rooms. It had its own jail. This was an enormous plantation. It was finally destroyed in 1952. But this is what it looked like in the 1930s when it had been run down. But it was, you don't get the size. If a person was standing here on the stairs, it would be, if you can see my mouse, maybe about this tall. This thing was an enormous building. And it was indicative of the sugarcane plantations in Louisiana. This is Longwood Plantation in Natchez. This is an interesting home because most of the home is unfinished. The only part that's finished is the basement. All the rest of it on the interior was unfinished, and that's because the man who was building it, the war began, and so he ran out of money and time, and it just was never finished. This is Kendall Manor in Eufaula, Alabama. This home actually belonged to a Jefferson descendant, and it's still privately owned, and every now and then it's on the spring pilgrimage tour, but it is a beautiful home, and again, very indicative of the type of plantation homes. Now, this was not a plantation home per se, but it was designed, it had the cupola at the top, kind of a Georgian-style architecture. It was very much designed at that time. This is the Woolfolk Plantation in Columbus, Georgia. This building still stands. John W. Woolfolk was one of the original proprietors of Columbus, had owned a large tract of Columbus. If you go to the WTVM studios in Columbus, Georgia, the home, it still looks just like this. There are some crepe myrtles in the front yard now, and there's a driveway over here and a driveway over here. But one of these trees, I think this tree still stands, but it is privately owned, but it's right near the WTVM studios. It's right behind it. So this home was built in the 1830s, and it's still there. And then you had St. Elmo in Columbus, Georgia. This at one time was called El Dorado, but this home still stands. It's over near Lake Bottom Park. But the book, St. Elmo, which was the best-selling book in the United States for a time, was actually written with this house in mind. So there it is. Plantation was to be a self-contained unit. Here you had typical plantation, so you had the plantation home, the slave cabins, and they would have other work buildings. Then they would grow all kinds of different crops. They'd have pasture land for animals. They'd have woods for timber, cash crops, of course, cotton and rice. But the woods out here, they would, the idea of a plantation was to be completely independent from anywhere else. You fed your population there, both the white and black population off the plantation. You tried to produce as many things as you could on the plantation: furniture, nails, glass, shoes, clothes, leather goods, anything you needed. You tried to buy on the you tried to make on the plantation, so you didn't have to buy it anywhere else. This is complete independence, which is why these people were so rigidly determined to maintain that independence for much of American history. So Southem Society, if you look at that, you'd have the rich class, which I just went into. Upcountry whites or poor whites were often called crackers from the term corn crackers. So that's actually where the term came from. You did have a productive middle class. And most Southerners did not own slaves, nor could they afford to own slaves. In fact, only 25% of Southerners owned slaves. And really, when you break that down even further, only 5% were legal slave owners. So 95% of the Southern population were not legal slave owners. If you look at families, it was about 25%, but then 75% didn't. So most of these Southerners were engaging in subsistence and small market agriculture. And in many cases, poor whites had the same living standards as slaves. They often worked side by side in the Black Belt region. And some slaves even looked down on poor whites, and they called them white trash. So you had this very complex picture in the South. It's not necessarily what you get out of modern popular culture. This is a typical Southern homestead. You can see the cabin here. You might have had a one-room cabin, maybe a two-room cabin, a dog trot cabin. You had a cow pen. So we talked about the Celts and their cow pens. You had an outbuilding, but this is how Southerners lived. Dirt floors, very little in the way of luxury goods. Most Southerners lived this way. And they weren't in the upper class of the South. Now, a major problem for American historians has been identifying African heritage and its impact on the United States. Remember, Africa is not a country but a continent with various cultures and traditions of its own. Most Americans of African descent actually arrived from West Africa, and Africans constitute one of the oldest ethnic groups in the United States. Now, there's a very famous Southern slavery historian, I should say. He's actually not Southern. He's from New York, but he wrote a lot about slavery, and this particular book, Roll, Jordan, Roll, is one of the best. He said, his name is Eugene Genovese, and he said, blacks and whites in America may be viewed as one nation or two, or as a nation within a nation, but their common history guarantees that one way or another, they are both American. Genovese is simply saying that blacks and whites really constituted an important component of American culture. So determining what is African and what is European has been this problem. After the close of the international slave trade in 1808, really Africans lost contact with the old world, but African traditions became part of the slave community. Much of African American history is confined within the context of slavery. And of course, Africans have a 390-year influence on American history and culture because they've been here that long. Longer than some groups that were, the Italians, for example, in American history. Africans have been here longer. So they did have an influence on Southern culture, without a doubt. Religion, West African traditions saturate black Christianity, particularly notions of the supernatural, things like voodoo and hoodoo. Language, words like tote have African origins and mixed with Southern English dialect to Cavalier dialect to form a Southern dialect or Celtic dialect. The Gula in South Carolina, this is a distinct culture in the low country of South Carolina that really kind of developed independently and had this, still maintained much of their, maybe perhaps some of the traditions from Africa. The first Africans were actually imported to North America in 1619, only by accident. And only non-Christian Africans were bound for life. And the first legal case of lifelong bondage in Virginia was by an African enslaving an African, and that's how it actually happened. So Virginia did not codify lifelong bondage until this particular case. And the first stop in North America was often Bristol, Rhode Island, or Newport, Rhode Island, not somewhere in the South. So Northerners were making a tremendous amount of money on the slave trade, which is why they wanted to keep it open until 1808. African Americans made up about 30 or 40% of the Southern population in 1860. They were over half of the population in Mississippi and South Carolina. You did have some free blacks and mulattoes. And what you essentially see is that there's a mutual dependency between whites and blacks in the South. And that mutual dependency created a very complex social relationship. You did have slave codes. For example, by law, slaves could not congregate anywhere but church. They couldn't be out after dark. They couldn't own firearms. And they couldn't really own property. But most of these things were ignored. And the historians have found in slave cabins firearms. They know that slaves had property. As the 19th century went on, as we got into the 19th century, this became wider and wider practiced in many places. Because there was such a microscope looking at the South, Southerners were trying to ensure that in terms of material conditions, slaves could not be their treatment of slaves could not be criticized. Slaves were allowed to have passes. If you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, which we'll talk about at the end of this presentation, they kind of get into this, but the book gets into it much more. And Solomon Northrop, when he told this story, talked about passes and how these things were very freely given. If he was going somewhere and needed food, he'd just stop at a plantation, they'd feed him. There was the brutal element of slavery, which we'll get into. But then there was this other kind of complex element of slavery. You did have slave catchers, and these people were highly feared because they would try to round up slaves who didn't have a pass. And, of course, then you would receive punishment for that. And, of course, you also had kidnappers who would try to round up free blacks at times in the North and sell them into bondage in the South because of the slave trade itself. But generally what you can say is that the attitude of the master or overseer and the type and location of the farm or plantation affected the condition of the slave. Most slaves actually preferred to be on large plantations because there was more of a community. But usually, if you were on a small farm, your treatment may have been a little better, but not always. So again, it just depended on who the person was that possessed your labor. as to how you were going to be treated. The living conditions for slaves, again, varied. The slaves' cabins were comparable to what poor whites had. You would have several families in a cabin, or maybe not families, but you might have 8 people living in a cabin, men on one side, women on the other. That might have been possible. Again, it depended on what kind of money that the people had that provided for your care. Slaves were given medical care, though, again, it's rudimentary. Their clothing was generally coarse fibers, wasn't very comfortable, but they could, as they made money, which slaves could make money, they could purchase other things to make their life a little more comfortable. Slaves did work perhaps 12 hours a day, sometimes longer, but generally the historical consensus is that there was an attempt to try to limit work days at times, particularly in times of the season where there wasn't as much going on. But in harvest time, slaves did work as many as 16, 17 hours a day. So this was a hard lot in life. But again, everybody in the South, except for the plantation owners themselves, worked this kind of work. If you had your own farm, you were working like that too. So work was hard, but work was hard in the North and the South in general. So the types of work, you could be a field hand, you could pick cotton, you could pick sugar cane, you could pick rice. Depended on what plantation you're on, what kind of work you're going to be doing. You could be a house servant or a body servant, working in the house itself. You could be the servant to a man or a woman, primarily to help them dress or take care of themselves, that kind of thing. You could be a cook, that was a specialized skill. You could be a skilled laborer. You could be a carpenter, a mason, a blacksmith, a glassmaker. And so there were skilled laborers, and these people could be hired out to others, and they would get to keep some of the profits of what they did. Of course, the plantation owner would get money as well, but so they didn't get to keep all their labor. You could be a nanny or a wet nurse. A wet nurse is someone who nurses another person's children, another woman's child. You could be a midwife and help birth babies. You could be an overseer. In fact, many overseers were slaves. So it wasn't just whites who were overseers, it was also slaves themselves who were overseers. So you had a large diversity of work that people could have done on a plantation in this context of slavery. Here's some typical slave quarters in South Carolina. They could have been, these are brick, these are actually nicer, but you could have had wood frame building, not really well insulated. Of course, they are going to have fireplaces. But again, these homes were very much like what poor whites would have in the South. So Southerners who had slaves couldn't understand the critique oftentimes in terms of material conditions. They said that slaves were well treated. Of course, there's always that element of freedom in there that is ignored in that assessment. Methods of work, the task system was used on rice plantations, and basically you were told to clear a certain amount of land and then you're free for the day. And this was very popular in low country South Carolina and Georgia on rice plantations. So you might have been told to clear half an acre or an acre and then you're done. So people would get up very early, they'd do that work, and then the rest of the day was theirs. And they would actually engage in market agriculture. They'd have their own little plot of land. They would make their own food. They would grow their own food for sale. They would go fishing. Anything to support themselves better. And a lot of these plantation owners were absentee landowners. So travelers through this area remarked that they saw slaves out fishing or doing things when they thought they would be working, but because of the task system, they were free to engage in other activities. And one particular slave actually was a horse breeder, which was illegal, but he did it anyways and made a lot of money selling horses that he had bred. The gang system was much more popular. Slaves were divided for plantation owners. Slaves were divided into groups and work until they're told to stop. Much more common system, particularly on large cotton and sugar plantations. So these are when you worked for so many hours. You had to pick so much cotton a day, or pick so much sugar cane a day, cut so much sugar cane. But this again, the task system much less common, gang system more common. Now, in the 19th century, you had a debate going back and forth between northern free labor proponents and slave proponents. Southerners argued that slavery was a more humane system than free wage labor in the 19th century. They said because slaves were fed, clothed, lodged, and provided medical care, and northern workers were not. The material conditions of slaves were actually better. And even Marxist historians have pointed out that, yeah, this is probably true. But, of course, you're taking away the element of freedom. The slave diet often contained meat, which was not the case of northern wage workers. Again, that was true. And the United States was the only slaveholding country to show an increase in slave population due to natural birth rate. And so the slave population was growing not from importing slaves, but from natural birth rate. Now, the northern response was often that, well, okay, material conditions are one thing, but what about punishment and living in fear and the lack of freedom? This is where the free wage labor didn't have to worry about these things. They weren't punished the way slaves were for not performing their job. So the situation was drastically different to them. And of course, that element of fear, always being afraid for your life or what's going to happen to you, that was something that slaves did have to live with. Now, the punishments on a plantation varied. Whipping was the most common form of punishment for minor crimes, even in the 19th century South across the board, even in the North across the board. It was the common punishment for crimes at times. So whipping was seen as a way to punish people. But by the 19th century, brutal forms of punishments like branding, ear cropping, mutilations, iron collars, castration, suffocating confinement, all these things had virtually disappeared in the United States. Because, again, Southerners knew that people were watching them. So these things did happen. I mean, there were some brutal forms of punishment at times. As did slave breeding, the split and sale of families, kidnapping, rape. But abolitionist attacks were often exaggerated for political reasons. But then again, on the other hand, Southerners may have underestimated how much these things did happen. You did have slave markets and slave traders, and slave markets and slave traders were considered to be the lowest form of slavery, and slave traders were actually, looked down on in society. These people were the lowest of the low, even though people would purchase slaves from them, and you did have slave markets. These people were not very well accepted in society. The average cost to purchase a slave was between $12,000 and $120,000, $2,013, depending on what the slave could do. Male or female, all kinds of things. But this is a very expensive type of labor, because after you purchase a slave, then you had to provide for them, and that costs a fair amount of money as well. Now, there were people who were pro-slavery ideologues in the South, and the origins really are found in Northern theological instruction. People like George Whitefield, who we talked about early in the class, was highly pro-slavery. He said that the Bible actually sanctioned it. So Northern preachers were insistent on the necessity of slavery. They said it had biblical roots. And the Great Awakenings really brought a religious defense of slavery to the South. We talked about how some of the earliest, we're going to talk about, in the next presentation, how some of the earliest efforts to end slavery were actually in the South. Benjamin Rush was a founding father, medical doctor from Pennsylvania. He actually said race was a disease. He called it Negroism. But he was against slavery because he thought Africans should be pitied because of their disease of race. But the important thing about Rush is that his student, Charles Caldwell, would develop a biological racism based on medical findings, that race was biological, and so therefore he had these very racist arguments. James Henry Hammond was a South Carolina planter. This guy is often dusted off as the example of the quintessential Southerner, but he was an exception rather than the rule. This guy was the worst of the worst. He kept a 13-year-old slave mistress, mistress, and then when she got too old, he kept her daughter, a 13-year-old woman, as his mistress. So he had many kids with his slaves. He had molested his nieces. He was what we would call today a sexual predator. But he was very much pro-slavery. He in fact said that the reason he was for it is because every society, he said, had a mudsill, the lowest level of society, the jobs that nobody else wants to do. And slaves filled that position, freed up other people not to have to do that. So the South was just having a system that took care of that problem. Then you have people like George Fitzhugh, who was a Southern socialist. His defense of slavery actually was beyond race. He thought slavery was a beneficial institution that all should be enslaved, black and white, who couldn't care for themselves. His book, Cannibals All, in 1857, really outlined this. But what about white slaves? You did have them. So you had people that were slaves that were white. And that's because This question about how much blood made you a slave, was it 1 drop, 1/8, 1/4, 1/10, 1/2, what was it? But you did have white slaves, people that looked white that were actually enslaved, and you did have black slave owners. In fact, in the 1830 census, free blacks owned about 10,000 slaves in the South. And some people thought this was for humanitarian gain. Well, they're only going to own their slaves because they want to keep them from being abused. Well, that's not true. A free black man named Anthony Duplessis owned a sugar plantation and 100 slaves worth about $8 million. William Ellison, who was also a free black, owned a 900-acre cotton plantation and 70 slaves in South Carolina. He was actually considered to be the worst slave owner in the district. He engaged in slave breeding, which was really looked down upon, but this is what Ellison did. So this is all for commercial gain. In fact, there's a book entitled Black Slave Owners by a man named Larry Coger. He concluded this. Black slaveholding was primarily an institution based on the exploitation of slaves rather than a benevolent system centered on kinship or humanitarianism. Now, what about slave resistance? It did happen. You had a very violent rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 called the Stono Rebellion, where a lot of people were killed. You had the Denmark-Vesey plot in 1822, also in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina. This plot was foiled, and Denmark-Vesey was hung. Denmark-Vesey was not a slave. He was actually a migrant from a Caribbean country. And the slaves themselves sold him out, and Vesey was killed. Then you had the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831. This actually produced the slaughter of about 60 white men, women, and children by a slave, Nat Turner, who was a minister. And eventually he was rounded up and executed. But the question is, why didn't more rebel? I mean, you have some examples like this, but why didn't more rebel? Well, because of the complex nature of the institution. And even if slaves could rebel, where would they go? There's nowhere to go. It was also very paternalistic, and slave owners tried to think of themselves, these slaves in some cases, as extended families. And there was some kind of, particularly with house servants and people like that, there was a kind of common bond. But slaves really didn't have a choice oftentimes. And not just that, a lot of them weren't inclined to rebel. So you did have these things in certain areas over time, but far less than people would think, actually. Now, were slave owners ultra-capitalists or something else? Were they ultra-capitalists because they owned the means of production, made a lot of money, or were they just paternalistic landowners who were just having kind of a feudal estate and living the life of luxury? But it was a little different than that. This debate is still open. I think you can look at both sides of the issue and say, well, that makes sense. Now, slavery in popular culture, you have things like Roots, Uncle Tom's Cabin, 12 Years a Slave. These are often sensationalized accounts designed to have an effect. Eugene Genovese again said that the white South, almost with one voice in the late antebellum period, denounced cruelty to slaves and denied that much of it exists. Here and there, yes, one can find it. To a significant or noteworthy extent, no. Northerners who knew the South well often agreed. So again, Genovese's conclusion is that, there was violence, there was cruelty, but it really wasn't that much. But again, one would be too much. But it wasn't as much as you would get, say, out of a movie like Roots or 12 Years a Slave. Okay, so we'll pick up with presentation 20 next time.